The rain had been falling over downtown Chicago since early evening, turning the streets into mirrors that reflected the neon lights of restaurants and boutiques. It was one of those cold October nights when the wind cut through coats and made people walk faster, seeking shelter in warm places. Grace Williams wiped down the last table in the corner of Étoile Noire, the upscale French restaurant where she had worked for nearly 3 years. Her black uniform was impeccable, her apron spotless, and her movements precise. Years of practice had taught her to be invisible. That was the unspoken rule in places like this. Blend into the background, anticipate needs before they're voiced, and never, ever draw attention to yourself. She was 42 years old, though the exhaustion in her eyes made her look older. Her shifts usually ended at 11, but tonight the restaurant was busier than usual. A corporate event had filled the main dining room, and the kitchen staff was overwhelmed. Grace didn't mind. Extra hours meant extra money, and she needed every dollar she could get. Her daughter, Maya, was starting college next fall. The scholarship covered tuition, but there were books, supplies, housing deposits. Grace had been saving for years, working double shifts when she could, skipping meals to stretch her budget further. Maya didn't know about the sacrifices. Grace made sure of that. "Table 7 needs water," called Marcus, one of the senior waiters, barely glancing her way as he rushed past with a tray of appetizers. Grace nodded and grabbed a pitcher from the service station. Table 7 was occupied by a young man she'd noticed earlier, mid-20s, dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than her monthly rent. He sat alone, his phone face down on the white tablecloth, a half-empty glass of expensive Bordeaux beside his plate. She approached quietly, her steps deliberate and silent on the polished hardwood floor. "More water, sir?" she asked softly, keeping her gaze respectfully lowered. He didn't look up, didn't acknowledge her presence, just gave the slightest nod, his attention fixed on the window where raindrops raced down the glass. Grace poured the water with steady hands, the ice clinking gently against the crystal. She'd learned long ago not to take the silence personally. In restaurants like Étoile Noire, people like her were furniture, functional, necessary, but not worth noticing. She stepped back, blending once more into the shadows of the dining room. The young man, his name was displayed on the reservation list as C. Harrington, finished his meal slowly, methodically. Dover sole with brown butter and capers, roasted fingerling potatoes, haricots verts. He cut each piece with surgical precision, chewed thoughtfully, and never once looked at his phone. Grace observed him from across the room as she folded napkins. There was something deliberate about his movements, something calculated. Most of their wealthy clientele either chatted loudly with companions or scrolled through their devices between bites. This man did neither. He ate in complete silence, as if the meal was a task to be completed rather than enjoyed. If you're enjoying this story and want to see what happens next, please subscribe to our channel. We're just starting out, and your support helps us bring you more incredible stories like this one. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss the shocking twist coming up. At 10:47 p.m., C. Harrington set down his fork and knife in parallel across his plate, the European signal that he was finished. He dabbed his mouth with the linen napkin, folded it precisely, and placed it beside his plate. Then he stood, reaching into his jacket pocket. Grace moved forward to clear the table, but something made her pause. The young man was pulling out loose change, not bills but coins. Quarter by quarter he placed them on the table. 6 quarters, 1 dime, 3 pennies, 1, 63. The meal had cost $87, not including wine. Grace felt her chest tighten. She'd received small tips before, even no tips occasionally. But this felt different. This felt intentional. The coins were scattered across the white tablecloth in a pattern that seemed almost mocking. Too random to be an accident, too deliberate to be thoughtless. See, Harrington straightened his jacket, glanced once at the scattered coins, and walked toward the exit without a word. His shoes clicked against the floor with each step, the sound fading as he disappeared into the vestibule. Grace stood frozen for a moment, staring at the table. Marcus passed by and saw the coins. He let out a low whistle. "Damn, Grace, that's cold." She didn't respond. What was there to say? Swallowing the humiliation, she moved to the table and began gathering the coins, her fingers trembling slightly as they scraped across the smooth fabric. Each clink as they dropped into her palm felt heavier than it should. This wasn't about the money. It was about what the gesture represented, a reminder of her place, a message written in loose change. She was reaching for the last nickel when her hand brushed against the dinner plate. It shifted slightly. Grace froze. The plate wasn't centered properly. The careful arrangement of cutlery, the precisely folded napkin, the calculated scattering of coins, everything else on the table spoke of someone who paid attention to details. But the plate was off-center by at least an inch, maybe more. Her pulse quickened. Slowly she glanced around the dining room. Marcus was busy seating a late-arriving couple. The hostess was checking reservations at the front podium. The kitchen doors swung open and closed as servers moved in and out. No one was watching her. Grace set down the coins and lifted the edge of the plate. Underneath, pressed flat against the tablecloth, was a white envelope. Her breath caught in her throat. The envelope was unmarked, sealed, and thick. Something was clearly inside. It wasn't a napkin, wasn't a piece of trash. Someone had deliberately placed it there, hidden where it would only be found by the person cleaning the table. Grace's mind raced. Should she open it? Should she call Marcus? What if it was something inappropriate? Something that could get her in trouble? Before she could decide, a voice cut through the ambient noise of the restaurant. Grace Williams? She jerked her hand back, the plate settling with a soft clink. Richard Cole, the restaurant manager, stood 5 feet away. His expression was unreadable, his arms crossed over his chest. He was a thin man in his 50s with wire-rimmed glasses and a perpetually anxious demeanor. Tonight, he looked even more tense than usual. Yes, Mr. Cole? Grace's voice came out steadier than she felt. There's someone asking for you at the front. Her stomach dropped. Asking for me? The gentleman who was sitting at table 7, he came back. Richard's eyes flicked to the table, then back to her face. He says he left something behind. Did you find anything? Time seemed to slow down. Grace's hand rested on the edge of the tablecloth, inches from where the envelope lay hidden beneath the plate. The coins sat in a small pile near the edge of the table, catching the light from the chandelier above. She started. Did you find anything or not? Richard's tone sharpened with impatience. Grace's mind spun through possibilities. The young man had left the coins as if they were nothing. He'd walked out without a glance back. And now, minutes later, he'd returned specifically asking about something he'd left behind. The envelope under the plate suddenly felt radioactive. I found these coins, sir, Grace said carefully, gesturing to the small pile. That's all. Richard frowned. Coins. He came back for coins. That's what he left on the table. And nothing else? You're certain? Grace met his eyes directly. Just the coins, Mr. Cole. The manager studied her for a long moment, his jaw working as if chewing over her words. Finally, he sighed. All right, come with me. He wants to speak with you directly. Grace's heart hammered against her ribs. He wants to speak with me? Now, Grace. She had no choice. Leaving the envelope where it lay, hidden beneath the plate, Grace followed Richard toward the front of the restaurant. Her mind raced with questions. Why would he come back? What was in the envelope? And why would he ask to speak with the person who'd cleaned his table? As they approached the entrance, Grace saw him. See, Harrington stood near the hostess stand, raindrops still glistening on the shoulders of his expensive suit. Up close, she could see his face more clearly. Sharp cheekbones, dark hair precisely styled, eyes the color of slate. He couldn't have been older than 27, but he carried himself with the confidence of someone much older. When he saw Grace, something flickered across his expression. Recognition? Relief? She couldn't tell. This is Grace Williams, Richard said, his tone hovering between professional and obsequious. She was assigned to your section. The young man's gaze locked onto Grace's face. For the first time all evening, he truly looked at her. And in that moment, Grace realized something that sent ice through her veins. This wasn't about coins. This had never been about coins. Miss Williams, he said, his voice smooth and measured. I believe I left something at my table. Something important. Did you happen to find it? The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Grace could feel Richard's eyes boring into the side of her face, waiting for her response. The restaurant's ambient noise, the clinking of silverware, the murmur of conversations, the soft jazz playing through hidden speakers, seemed to fade into the background. Something important, sir? Grace repeated, her voice carefully neutral. See. Harrington's expression remained unreadable. He didn't blink, didn't shift his weight, didn't betray any emotion. It was the face of someone trained to reveal nothing. Yes, a business document. I realized after I left that I may have accidentally left it at the table. His tone was polite, almost apologetic, but his eyes told a different story. They were searching her face, looking for something. A tell. A reaction. Grace's mind raced. The envelope was still under the plate, untouched. She could go back, retrieve it, hand it over, and this entire strange encounter would be over. She'd go back to being invisible, finish her shift, and ride the bus home to her cramped apartment. But something stopped her. The coins. The deliberate placement of the plate. The way he'd scattered those quarters and pennies across the tablecloth like he was making a point. And now this, returning minutes later with a convenient story about a forgotten document. Nothing about this felt accidental. "I cleared your table, sir," Grace said slowly. "The only thing you left behind was the payment." "The payment?" A slight crease appeared between his eyebrows. "The coins on the table, $1.63. Richard shifted uncomfortably beside her. The implication hung in the air. A $1.63 tip on an $87 meal at one of Chicago's most expensive restaurants. Something changed in C. Harrington's face, not embarrassment, not shame. Something closer to calculation. "I see," he said quietly. "And you're certain there was nothing else? Perhaps something that might have fallen? Slipped under something?" There it was. The real question. Grace met his gaze directly. Years of being overlooked, of being treated as part of the furniture, had taught her how to read people. And right now, she was reading desperation masked as control. "I'm certain, sir. Just the coins." For a long moment, no one spoke. The young man's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Then he nodded slowly, reaching into his wallet. "I apologize for the confusion," he said, pulling out a crisp $100 bill. "And for the insufficient gratuity earlier. Please, accept this." He extended the bill toward Grace. She stared at it, her mind whirling. This was more than double what she made in an entire shift. This was groceries for 2 weeks. This was the deposit for Maya's dorm room. This was everything she'd been scraping and saving for. And it was a test. "That's very generous, sir," Grace said carefully, not taking the money. "But it's not necessary." Richard made a small noise of protest beside her. But Grace didn't look away from C. Harrington's face. The young man's eyes narrowed slightly. "I insist. I appreciate the gesture, but the coins you left were sufficient." It was a bold-faced lie, and they both knew it. But Grace held her ground. After a moment that felt like an eternity, C. Harrington slowly folded the bill and returned it to his wallet. When he looked at her again, there was something different in his expression. Respect, curiosity, suspicion. "Very well," he said quietly. "I'm sorry to have troubled you. Have a good evening, Miss Williams." He turned and walked out into the rain without another word. Grace stood frozen, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. What the hell was that about? Richard hissed the moment the door closed. "He was offering you $100. "I know." "Then why?" "I don't know what he's looking for, Mr. Cole, but I didn't find anything at his table except coins." Grace turned to face him. "May I finish cleaning so I can go home? My daughter is waiting." Richard's face cycled through several emotions before settling on frustration. "Fine, finish up. But Grace, if you did find something, anything, you need to tell me. Corporate has strict policies about—" "There was nothing," Grace said firmly. "Just coins." She walked back toward table 7 before he could press further. Her hands were shaking now, the adrenaline finally catching up with her. She approached the table slowly, half expecting to find it empty. The envelope somehow vanished. But no, the plate was still slightly off-center, the white corner of the envelope just barely visible if you knew where to look. Grace glanced around once more. The dining room was emptying out as the night wound down. Marcus was in the back counting his tips. The hostess was organizing menus. The coast was as clear as it would get. Moving quickly, Grace lifted the plate and slid the envelope out, tucking it into the pocket of her apron in one smooth motion. Her heart hammered as she finished clearing the table, stacking plates with practiced efficiency, wiping down the surface. The envelope felt like it was burning a hole in her pocket. 40 minutes later, Grace pushed through the employee entrance into the alley behind the restaurant. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, and the night air was sharp with cold. She pulled her thin jacket tighter and started walking toward the bus stop 3 blocks away. Her phone buzzed. A text from Maya. "Mom, did you eat dinner? Don't forget." Grace smiled despite her exhaustion. "I ate, baby. Be home soon. Love you." She waited until she was halfway to the bus stop, surrounded by the relative anonymity of strangers hurrying through the rain-slicked streets, before she pulled out the envelope. It was heavier than she'd expected, the paper thick and expensive. No name, no address, just a simple white envelope sealed with what looked like wax. In the dim glow of the streetlights, she could make out an emblem pressed into the seal, something that looked like intertwined letters, though she couldn't make out the details. Grace's hands trembled as she broke the seal. Inside was a single folded piece of paper and something else, something that clinked softly as she tilted the envelope. She pulled out the paper first and unfolded it under a streetlight. The note was handwritten in neat, precise cursive. To whoever finds this, if you're reading this, you looked beyond the obvious. That makes you different from most people in that room tonight. What I've left under this plate is not a gift. It's a test and possibly a lifeline. Inside this envelope is a key and an address. Tomorrow at 3 p.m., go to the address. Come alone. Tell no one. I know what you're thinking. This could be dangerous. This could be a trap. You're right to be cautious. But consider this. I could have handed you this directly. I could have left it with the manager. Instead, I left it where only someone who truly pays attention would find it. You're invisible to people like me, aren't you? The ones who dine in places like Étoile Noire and never see the people who serve them. But I saw you tonight. I watched how you moved, how you anticipated needs, how you kept your dignity even when I left you coins instead of bills. I left those coins to see what you would do, whether you would curse me, complain to your coworkers, or simply accept the insult. You did none of those things. You breathed deeply and started cleaning. That told me everything I needed to know. The key in this envelope opens something valuable, but it only has value if you choose to use it. Tomorrow at 3 p.m., the address is below. This is your only chance. CH, below. The message was an address. 1847 North Lakeshore Drive, Unit 2207. Grace's hands shook so badly she almost dropped the paper. She tilted the envelope and a small brass key slid into her palm. It was old-fashioned, the kind that might open a safe deposit box or a filing cabinet, with a number etched into its surface. 2207. Her mind reeled. This was insane. This was dangerous. This was everything she'd taught Maya to avoid. Strange men, secret meetings, offers that seemed too good to be true. But the address on North Lakeshore Drive, she knew that area. Luxury high-rises overlooking Lake Michigan, penthouses that cost millions. Whatever was in Unit 2207, it wasn't in some abandoned warehouse or sketchy location. And the note was right about one thing. She was invisible, had been her entire life. People looked through her, around her, never directly at her. She'd accepted that reality, built her life around it. But someone had seen her tonight. The question was, why? Grace stood under the streetlight for a long time, rain misting around her, the key cold in her palm. In the distance, she could hear the rumble of the approaching bus. She had approximately 18 hours to decide whether to walk into whatever this was, whether to stay invisible or step into the light. Grace slept terribly that night. She lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling of her studio apartment, the key on her nightstand catching the orange glow of the streetlight outside. Maya was across town at her friend Jasmine's house, studying for midterms. The apartment felt emptier than usual. At 2 a.m., Grace got up and made tea, and she sat at her tiny kitchen table, the note spread out before her, reading it for the 20th time. I watched how you moved, how you anticipated needs, how you kept your dignity. Nobody had ever watched her like that, not as an observer of service, but as someone genuinely seeing her. At 6 a.m., she gave up on sleep and took a shower. The hot water ran out after 5 minutes. The landlord still hadn't fixed the boiler, and she finished in lukewarm spray, her mind churning through possibilities. This could be anything: a job offer, a prank, a scam, something worse. But it could also be what the note suggested: a lifeline. At 8 a.m., her phone rang. Unknown number. Grace stared at it for 3 rings before answering. Miss Williams? The voice was unfamiliar. Male. Professional. Yes? My name is David Chen. I'm an attorney with Blackwood & Associates. I'm calling regarding an opportunity that was presented to you last night at Étoile Noire. Grace's blood ran cold. I don't know what you're talking about. I think you do. The voice was calm, almost friendly. You found an envelope under a plate. You have a key and an address. I'm calling to confirm that the offer is legitimate and to provide additional context. How did you get my number? The person who left you that envelope is my client. He asked me to reach out this morning to ensure you understood the situation. Grace's hand tightened on the phone. What situation? I can't discuss details over the phone, but I can tell you this. If you choose to go to that address today at the specified time, you will not be in any danger. You will meet with my client in a secure public location. Whatever happens after that is entirely your choice. No one will force you to do anything, accept anything, or agree to anything. You are in complete control. Why me? The question burst out before she could stop it. There was a pause. I think that's something my client should explain himself. All I can tell you is that he believes you possess certain qualities that are rare and valuable. Valuable how? That's what tomorrow's meeting is about. 3 p.m., Miss Williams. The choice is yours. The line went dead. Grace stood in her kitchen, phone still pressed to her ear, her reflection staring back at her from the dark window. 18 hours had become 12, and she still had no idea what she was going to do. Grace spent the rest of the morning in a fog. She went through her routine mechanically, cleaning the apartment, doing laundry in the building's basement, checking her bank account, and wincing at the balance. $847.32. That's what 3 years of saving, of skipping lunches, of taking every extra shift had amounted to. Maya's dorm deposit alone was $1,500. By 10 a.m., Grace had made a decision. She pulled out her laptop, a refurbished model she'd bought 2 years ago, and searched for the address. 1847 North Lakeshore Drive. The building that appeared on her screen made her breath catch. Azure Tower. 43 stories of glass and steel overlooking Lake Michigan. The real estate listings showed penthouses starting at $3, $2 million. Amenities included a private gym, concierge service, rooftop terrace, and 24-hour security. Unit 2207 would be on the 22nd floor. Grace clicked through images of the building's lobby, all marble and chrome with modern art on the walls and doormen in crisp uniforms. This wasn't some sketchy location. This was one of the most exclusive addresses in Chicago, but that didn't mean it was safe. She searched for C. Harrington Chicago and found dozens of results. Most were for a Charles Harrington III, CEO of Harrington Industries, a manufacturing conglomerate worth billions. But the photos showed a man in his 60s, silver-haired and distinguished, not the young man from last night. Then she found a Society page article from 3 months ago. Christopher Harrington, son of Charles Harrington III, returns to Chicago after completing MBA at Wharton. The photo showed the same sharp cheekbones, the same slate-gray eyes. Christopher Harrington, 26 years old, heir to a fortune, and he'd left her coins on a table. Grace's phone buzzed. A text from Maya. Morning, Mom. Crushing this study session. Jasmine's mom is making us breakfast. Love you. Grace stared at the message, at her daughter's easy happiness, her bright future. Maya had worked so hard for that scholarship. She deserved every opportunity, every chance to build a life better than the one Grace had known. And here was Grace being offered. What exactly? What could a billionaire's son possibly want from a restaurant worker he'd never spoken to? At 11:30 a.m., Grace did something she rarely did. She called her sister. Denise Williams Cooper lived in Atlanta with her husband and 2 kids. She'd escaped Chicago 15 years ago, landing a job in hospital administration that had slowly, steadily pulled her into the middle class. The sisters talked maybe once a month, their lives having diverged so dramatically that they sometimes struggled to find common ground. Grace, is everything okay? Denise's voice carried immediate concern. Grace never called during the day. I'm fine, I need advice. Grace explained the situation, leaving out some of the stranger details but conveying the essential dilemma. A wealthy stranger had left her a cryptic invitation and a key, asking her to meet him in a luxury high-rise. The silence on the other end lasted so long that Grace thought the call had dropped. Denise? Grace, please tell me you're not seriously considering this. I don't know what I'm considering. That's why I'm calling. This is how people get hurt. Denise's voice rose. Some rich guy singles you out, leaves you a mysterious key, and you're actually thinking about going? This is dangerous. He had a lawyer call me this morning to... A lawyer? Grace, that makes it worse. This is orchestrated. This is planned. Whatever this man wants from you, it's nothing good. Grace felt her chest tighten. You don't know that. I know that people like us don't get mystery invitations from millionaires unless there's a catch. A big one. Denise's tone softened slightly. Honey, I know money is tight. I know you're stressed about Maya's school, but this isn't the answer. Please just throw the key away and forget this ever happened. After they hung up, Grace sat with her phone in her hand, her sister's words echoing in her mind. Denise was right. She was always right. Practical, cautious, thinking 3 steps ahead. It's why she'd succeeded where Grace had struggled. But something kept pulling Grace back to that note. I saw you tonight. When was the last time anyone had truly seen her? At 1 p.m., Grace started getting ready. She told herself she was just preparing, just keeping her options open. She could still decide not to go. She showered again, taking time with her appearance in a way she rarely did. Her work clothes were utilitarian, designed to blend in. But today she pulled out the one nice outfit she owned. A simple navy dress she'd bought at a thrift store for Maya's scholarship award ceremony. It was clean, professional, unremarkable, invisible. She looked at herself in the mirror, 42 years old, dark circles under her eyes from too many late shifts, hair pulled back in the same practical bun she always wore. When had she stopped seeing herself as anything other than a function, a worker, a mother, a means to an end? Her phone buzzed. Another unknown number. This time, a text message. A car will arrive at your building at 2:30 p.m. to take you to the address. You don't have to get in. But if you do, you'll be safely transported and safely returned home afterward regardless of your decision. Deech and Grace stared at the message. They knew where she lived. Of course they did. They'd gotten her phone number, hadn't they? But seeing it spelled out like that made it real. This was happening. This was actually happening. At 2:15 p.m., Grace stood in her apartment, the key in her pocket, wearing her navy dress and a coat that had seen better days. She thought about Maya, about the dorm deposit, about 3 more years of double shifts and exhaustion. She thought about being invisible. At 2:28 p.m., she walked downstairs. The black sedan was already waiting at the curb. The driver was a woman in her 40s, professional and courteous. She opened the back door without a word, and Grace slid inside onto leather seats that probably cost more than her monthly rent. The drive along Lakeshore Drive took 20 minutes through midday traffic. Grace watched the city pass by her window, the lake stretching gray and vast to the east, the towers of downtown rising to the west. She'd lived in Chicago her entire life, but had never been inside any of these waterfront buildings. The Azure Tower loomed ahead, all glass and sharp angles. The sedan pulled into an underground garage where a security guard checked a tablet and waved them through. The driver navigated to a private parking area and opened Grace's door. "Take the elevator to the 22nd floor," she said. "Someone will meet you there." Grace stepped out, her shoes clicking on polished concrete. The garage was quiet, almost eerily so, the kind of silence that only expensive soundproofing could provide. The elevator was waiting, its doors open. Grace stepped inside. The panel had buttons for every floor, but 22 was already illuminated. The doors slid closed with a soft hiss and the elevator began to rise. Her reflection stared back at her from the mirrored walls. She looked terrified. The elevator climbed smoothly, silently. Grace's ears popped slightly as they ascended. She clutched her purse, the key still in her coat pocket, and tried to steady her breathing. What was she doing here? The elevator chimed softly. 22nd floor. The doors opened. Grace stepped out into a hallway unlike anything she'd ever seen. The carpet was thick and pristine. Modern art hung on walls painted in soft grays. Recessed lighting created a warm, intimate atmosphere. There were only 4 doors on this entire floor, each spaced far apart. Unit 2207 was at the end of the hall. Grace walked toward it slowly, her heart hammering. With each step, she had the opportunity to turn back, get in the elevator, go home, forget any of this happened. But she kept walking. She reached the door and stood there staring at the brushed steel number plate 2207. Before she could knock, the door opened. But it wasn't Christopher Harrington standing there. It was a woman, late 50s, elegantly dressed in a cream pantsuit, her silver hair cut in a sharp bob. Her eyes were kind, but assessing, taking in Grace from head to toe in a single glance. "Miss Williams," she said warmly. "I'm Margaret Winters. Please come in." Grace hesitated at the threshold. "I thought I was meeting. Mr. Harrington is here. But first I'd like to speak with you if that's all right. Just a conversation, nothing more." Something in the woman's tone was reassuring. Grace stepped inside. The apartment took her breath away. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Lake Michigan, the water stretching to the horizon. The space was open and modern, with furniture that looked like art, and art that looked like it belonged in museums. But despite the obvious wealth, it felt lived in. There were books on shelves, a laptop open on a desk, a coffee mug on a side table. "Please sit," Margaret said, gesturing to a seating area near the windows. Grace sat on the edge of an armchair that probably cost more than her car. Margaret settled across from her, folding her hands in her lap. "I'm sure you have many questions." "I have nothing but questions," Grace said, finding her voice. Margaret smiled. "That's fair. Let me start by explaining who I am. I'm a private investigator and I've been working for the Harrington family for nearly 20 years. My specialty is vetting people, conducting background checks, assessing character, identifying potential risks. Grace's stomach dropped. You investigated me. Thoroughly. I know you're 42 years old, divorced for 6 years, raising a daughter named Maya who just won a full scholarship to Northwestern. I know you've worked at Étoile Noire for 3 years, never missed a shift, never had a single complaint. I know you send money to your mother in Memphis every month even though you can barely afford it. I know you've been saving for 3 years to cover Maya's living expenses at college. Grace felt exposed, violated. You had no right. You're absolutely correct. We had no right. But Christopher needed to be sure. Margaret's expression softened. Miss Williams, what I'm about to tell you will sound impossible, but I need you to hear me out. Grace gripped the arms of the chair. I'm listening. Christopher Harrington is not what he appears to be. Yes, he's the heir to a fortune. Yes, he has every advantage money can buy. But 6 months ago, his father was diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's. The prognosis is not good. Within a year, maybe 2, Charles Harrington will need to step down as CEO. I don't understand what this has to do with me. Everything, Margaret said quietly. Because Christopher doesn't want the company. He never has. But he's trapped by family expectations, board obligations, shareholder demands. And more importantly, he's discovered something. Something his father's generation built into the company's foundation that Christopher finds morally problematic. Grace's mind raced. What kind of something? That's not my story to tell. But Christopher is planning to expose it, to burn down his family's legacy and rebuild something better, something ethical. Margaret leaned forward. But to do that, he needs allies he can trust absolutely. People who can't be bought, can't be intimidated, can't be corrupted. People who are invisible to his family's network. People like me, Grace whispered. People exactly like you. Before Grace could respond, a door opened on the far side of the room. Christopher Harrington emerged, still wearing the same type of perfectly tailored suit, but his expression was different from the restaurant. There was intensity in his eyes now, purpose. Miss Williams, he said, crossing the room, thank you for coming. I know this is overwhelming, but I need to show you something. Something that will explain everything. He gestured toward the door he'd come through. It's in the next room, but I need to warn you. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. Once you know, you become part of this. And that comes with risks. Grace stood slowly, her legs unsteady. What kind of risks? The kind that could change your life, Christopher said. For better or worse. That depends on what you decide to do with the information. He extended his hand toward the door. Grace looked at Margaret, who nodded slightly, her expression unreadable. Every instinct Grace had screamed at her to leave. To walk out of this beautiful apartment, get in that elevator, go back to her invisible life where at least she knew the rules. But she thought about Maya, about 3 more years of scraping by, about being 42 years old and exhausted and unseen. Grace walked toward the door. Christopher opened it, revealing a room that looked like a small office. A desk, filing cabinets, and on every wall, photographs. Dozens of them. Documents, maps, a conspiracy board like something from a crime thriller, and in the center of it all, a photograph of a warehouse with a name Grace recognized. A name that made her blood run cold. Oh my God, she whispered. Now you see, Christopher said quietly behind her. Now you understand why I needed someone like you. Grace stared at the wall, her mind reeling, unable to process what she was seeing. Because the company in those photographs, the warehouse in that image, the names on those documents, they were connected to something she'd witnessed 3 years ago. Something she'd convinced herself she'd misunderstood. Something she'd tried desperately to forget. Grace's hand went to her mouth, her breath coming in short gasps. The photograph on the wall showed a warehouse she recognized immediately. The concrete facade, the loading docks, the faded blue paint on the industrial doors. But it was the logo that made her stomach turn. Meridian Logistics, a subsidiary company name she'd tried to forget. You worked there, Christopher said softly, stepping beside her. It wasn't a question. Grace nodded, unable to speak. 4 years ago, before Étoile Noire, you were part of the night cleaning crew. How do you... Grace's voice cracked. Because 3 years ago you filed an anonymous complaint with OSHA about unsafe conditions, chemical exposure, workers getting sick. Christopher pointed to a document pinned next to the photograph. The complaint was buried, dismissed as unsubstantiated. But you saw something, didn't you? Something specific. Grace closed her eyes, the memories flooding back. She'd taken that job out of desperation after her divorce. The pay was slightly better than restaurant work, and the night shift meant she could be home when Maya got back from school. For 8 months, she'd cleaned offices in that warehouse, emptied trash bins, mopped floors, and she'd noticed things. Workers with persistent coughs, skin rashes. One young man, barely 20, who'd collapsed during a shift and was carried out on a stretcher. The supervisors said it was exhaustion, dehydration, but Grace had seen the chemical barrels in the storage area, had smelled the acrid fumes that seeped through the ventilation system. She'd researched the symptoms during her breaks. Everything pointed to toxic exposure. Something in that warehouse was making people sick. So she'd filed the complaint, anonymously, because she couldn't afford to lose the job. But she'd thought someone would investigate, someone would care. 3 weeks later, she was fired. Budget cuts, they called it. But Grace knew better. Someone had connected the dots. She'd moved on, found work at the restaurant, buried the guilt of not doing more, convinced herself she'd been wrong, paranoid, overreacting. "You weren't wrong," Christopher said, as if reading her thoughts. He pulled a folder from the desk and opened it. Inside were medical records, incident reports, internal memos. Meridian Logistics is owned by Harrington Industries, has been for 15 years. And for 15 years, my father's company has been cutting corners on safety regulations to maximize profits. Grace scanned the documents, her hands shaking. Chemical exposure, respiratory illness. 3 deaths in the past decade, all ruled as unrelated to workplace conditions. But the medical evidence told a different story. The chemical they use in the manufacturing process is cheap, Christopher continued, his voice tight with controlled anger. It's legal, technically, but the ventilation systems required to use it safely are expensive. So my father's executives made a decision. Skip the proper ventilation, falsify the safety reports, and pay off inspectors when necessary. People died, Grace whispered. People are still dying. The warehouse you worked at is one of 7 Harrington facilities operating the same way. Hundreds of workers exposed, dozens sick. And my family's lawyers make sure every lawsuit is settled quietly, with NDAs attached. Margaret stepped into the room behind them. We've been documenting this for 6 months, building a case. But everything we have is circumstantial or obtained through less than legal means, nothing that would hold up in court. Grace turned to face them. Then why are you showing me this? Christopher's gray eyes met hers. Because you're the only person who witnessed the conditions firsthand and tried to report it. The only person whose testimony could corroborate our evidence. The only person who... No. Grace backed away, shaking her head. No, I can't. I filed that complaint anonymously for a reason. If I testify, if I come forward, they'll destroy me. Your family's lawyers will... They'll try, Christopher said. But not if we do this right. Do what right? You want me to go up against one of the richest families in Chicago? I have a daughter, I know exactly what you have. Christopher's voice was firm but not unkind. I know you have $847 in your bank account. I know Maya's dorm deposit is due in 6 weeks. I know you work 60-hour weeks and still can't afford to fix your car's transmission. I know everything about your life, Grace, and I know that what I'm asking could cost you everything. Grace felt tears sting her eyes. Then why? Why would you ask? Because I can't do this alone. Christopher's composure cracked slightly. My father built an empire on the backs of people like you. People who were invisible to him. People whose suffering was just a line item in a quarterly report. And I've spent my entire life benefiting from that suffering without knowing it existed. He moved to the wall, touching one of the photographs. A young woman in a hospital bed, oxygen tubes in her nose. Her name was Carmen Rodriguez, 23 years old. She worked at the Meridian facility for 2 years. Developed chronic respiratory failure. She's on permanent disability now, can't work, can't support her son. Harrington Industries paid her $50,000 to go away and never talk about it. Christopher turned back to Grace. I found her case file 3 months ago while reviewing acquisition documents. Started digging, found dozens more, hundreds. And I realized everything my family stood for, everything I was supposed to inherit, was built on this. On destroying lives and calling it business. So expose it, Grace said. You have evidence. You have resources. Why do you need me? Because judges don't trust whistleblowers who inherit billions, Margaret interjected. They see ulterior motives, family feuds. but a working-class woman who witnessed the conditions firsthand, who tried to report it through proper channels and was ignored. That's credible. That's powerful. Grace's mind raced. You want me to be the face of this, the primary witness? Yes, Christopher said simply. And in exchange? In exchange, I make sure you and Maya are protected. Financially, legally, physically, whatever happens, you don't face it alone. Grace laughed bitterly. Protected? You just told me your family has lawyers who bury lawsuits and pay off inspectors. What makes you think you can protect me from them? Because I'm not just another whistleblower. Christopher's expression hardened. I'm the heir. I control trusts worth hundreds of millions. I have access to company systems, board meeting minutes, attorney-client communications. I can leak information they can't trace back to me. I can create chaos from the inside while you tell the truth from the outside. This is insane. Yes, Christopher agreed. It is, and it's dangerous, and it could blow up in our faces spectacularly. Then why? Because it's the right thing to do. His voice was quiet but intense. And I think you know that. I think that's why you filed that complaint 3 years ago, even though you knew it could cost you your job. I think that's why you're standing here right now instead of walking out. Grace looked around the room at the evidence plastered across the walls. Medical records of people she'd worked alongside. People who'd smiled at her in break rooms. Who'd shared coffee from vending machines. Who'd been just as invisible as she was. People who were dying. She thought about Maya. About the future she'd fought so hard to build for her daughter. About the risk of throwing it all away. But she also thought about the young man on the stretcher. About Carmen Rodriguez and her son. About all the people still working in those facilities, breathing poison, trusting that someone cared about their safety. What exactly are you proposing? Grace asked carefully. Christopher exchanged a glance with Margaret, then gestured for Grace to sit. She did, her legs weak. Phase 1, he began, is documentation. You write down everything you witnessed at Meridian, every detail, dates, times, specific incidents. Margaret will help you organize it into a formal statement. Phase 2 is verification. We use your statement to obtain subpoenas for company records that corroborate your account. Medical records, maintenance logs, chemical inventories. We build an airtight case. Phase 3 is exposure. We go public. Press conference, federal investigation, civil lawsuits. And yes, it will be brutal. The company will attack your credibility. They'll dig into your past, but we'll be ready for that. Margaret pulled out another folder. We've already prepared contingencies, character witnesses, expert testimony on workplace safety, media strategy to control the narrative, and most importantly, she slid a document across the desk. Financial security. Grace picked up the paper. It was a contract. Her eyes scanned the terms, barely comprehending the numbers. This is a retainer agreement, Margaret explained. If you agree to participate as a witness, you'll be paid a monthly stipend to cover living expenses during the investigation. $5,000 per month, guaranteed for at least 18 months regardless of the case outcome. Grace's mouth went dry. $5,000 a month. That was more than she made working 60 hours a week. And this, Christopher placed another document in front of her, is a college trust for Maya. $200,000, fully funded regardless of whether you proceed past the initial statement. It's yours once you sign the retainer. No strings attached. Grace stared at the numbers, her vision blurring. You're trying to buy me. No, Christopher said firmly. I'm trying to make sure that doing the right thing doesn't destroy your life. There's a difference. Is there? Grace looked up at him. Because this feels like a bribe, like you're paying me to say what you want me to say. Then don't take the money, Christopher said. Walk away. Go back to your life. I'll find another way. His jaw tightened. But those workers won't. They'll keep breathing poison. They'll keep getting sick. They'll keep trusting that the system will protect them, even though we both know it won't. Grace felt the weight of his words settle over her. He was right. She'd seen the system fail firsthand. She'd been part of that failure, hadn't she? Filing an anonymous complaint and then walking away when it became too hard. I need time, she said finally. I need to think about this. Of course. Christopher nodded. Take 48 hours. After that, I'll need an answer. If it's no, we'll never contact you again. The college trust is yours either way. Call it. Compensation for your time tonight. Grace stood, her mind spinning. $200,000 just for listening to your pitch? Think of it as an apology, Christopher said quietly, for what my family's company did to you, for firing you when you tried to do the right thing, for 3 years of guilt you've been carrying that was never yours to bear. Margaret walked Grace to the door. As they reached it, Grace turned back to Christopher. That night at the restaurant, the coins. That was deliberate, wasn't it? You were testing me. Yes, he admitted. I needed to see how you'd react to disrespect. Whether you'd retaliate, complain, or maintain your dignity. It was cruel and I apologize. But I had to know who you were when no one was watching. And the envelope under the plate? I gambled that you were the kind of person who pays attention to details, who notices when things are out of place. I was right. Grace shook her head slowly. You could have just approached me, asked me directly. Would you have believed me? Would you have come? She considered that. If a billionaire's son had walked up to her at the restaurant and asked her to help expose his family's crimes, she would have thought it was a joke, or a trap. She never would have trusted it. Maybe not, she conceded. I needed you to choose this, Christopher said. Not because I asked, but because you saw the evidence and decided it mattered. Margaret opened the door. The car will take you home. You have my number. Call any time, day or night, if you have questions. Grace stepped into the hallway, then paused. Why are you doing this? Really? You could walk away, take your inheritance and ignore all of this. Christopher was silent for a long moment. My mother died when I was 12. Cancer. She worked for my father's company in her 20s, before they married, in the quality control division at one of the chemical plants. Understanding dawned. She was exposed. The company doctors said it was genetic, unavoidable. But I found her employee medical records last year. Repeated complaints about headaches, nausea, respiratory issues, all dismissed. His voice was barely a whisper. My father knew. He knew the conditions were dangerous. And he married her anyway, never telling her what she'd been exposed to, never giving her a chance to get early treatment. I'm sorry, Grace said softly. Don't be sorry. Help me make sure no one else loses their mother to my family's greed. The ride home was a blur. Grace sat in the back of the sedan, the contract and college trust documents in her purse, feeling like she'd stepped into someone else's life. When she walked into her apartment, it looked smaller than ever. The peeling paint, the thrift store furniture, the constant drip from the kitchen faucet she couldn't afford to fix. This was her reality. This was what she'd been fighting to escape. And now someone was offering her a way out. But at what cost? Her phone buzzed. Maya. Mom, you home? Can I come back tonight instead of tomorrow? Grace texted back. Of course, baby. I'll pick you up. Be there in 30. As she drove across the city in her aging Honda, Grace thought about everything she'd seen in that apartment. The evidence, the medical records, the faces of people she'd worked with, people who were suffering because someone decided profits mattered more than lives. She thought about the complaint she'd filed 3 years ago, how hopeless she'd felt when nothing came of it, how she'd convinced herself it didn't matter, that one person couldn't make a difference. But maybe one person could, if they had the right allies, the right resources, the right moment. When she picked up Maya, her daughter was glowing with excitement about her study session, about college plans, about the future she couldn't wait to start. You okay, Mom? Maya asked, noticing Grace's distracted expression. You look tired. Just a long day, sweetheart. Grace forced a smile. Tell me about your study session. As Maya talked, Grace made a decision. Tomorrow she would read through every page of those documents Christopher had given her. She would verify everything, question everything, look for any sign that this was manipulation or a trap. But if it was real, if this was genuinely a chance to expose the truth and protect people who were as invisible as she'd always been, then she knew what her answer would be. Some things were worth the risk. Some silences needed to be broken. And maybe, just maybe, the most invisible person in the room was exactly who the world needed to see. Grace spent that night reading. After Maya fell asleep, she spread the documents across her kitchen table and began going through them, page by page. The college trust paperwork was legitimate. She'd looked up the law firm that drafted it, called their public number just to confirm they existed. They did. Blackwood & Associates was one of the most prestigious firms in Chicago. The retainer agreement was equally real. Margaret Winters was listed as a licensed private investigator with 20 years of experience. Her credentials checked out, but it was the medical records that kept Grace awake until 3 a.m. Carmen Rodriguez, age 23, admitted to Northwestern Memorial with acute respiratory distress, chemical burn to lung tissue consistent with prolonged exposure to industrial solvents. Permanent disability rating, 70%. Marcus Chen, age 31, diagnosed with chronic obstructive pulmonary disease after 18 months at Meridian Logistics. Never smoked a day in his life. Patricia Johnson, age 47, dead, lung cancer, 3 years from diagnosis to death, worked at the Meridian facility for 6 years. Grace remembered Patricia, a quiet woman who'd always brought homemade cookies to share during breaks. She'd had a cough, Grace recalled, a persistent rattling cough that never seemed to improve. She'd mentioned seeing a doctor, but Grace had moved on to the restaurant job before learning what happened. Now she knew. At 4 a.m., Grace finally went to bed, but sleep wouldn't come. She stared at the ceiling, Christopher's words echoing in her mind. My family's company did this, and I've been benefiting from it my entire life without knowing. Could she believe him? Could she trust that this wasn't some elaborate scheme? The question haunted her through the restless hours until dawn. The next morning, Grace did something she rarely did. She called in sick to work. Richard sounded irritated but accepted her excuse of a stomach bug. She'd never missed a shift in 3 years. He could hardly complain. With Maya at school, Grace had the day to herself. She started by visiting the public library, using their computers to dig deeper. She searched for news articles about Harrington Industries, looking for any hint of controversy or scandal. What she found was mostly positive press, charitable donations, job creation. Charles Harrington III photographed at galas and ribbon-cutting ceremonies. The image of a responsible corporate citizen. But buried in the business section of a newspaper from 8 months ago, she found a small article. Harrington Industries settles workplace safety lawsuit. The details were vague, an undisclosed amount paid to an unnamed plaintiff. The company admitted no wrongdoing. Grace searched for more settlements, found 3 more in the past 5 years, all quietly resolved, all sealed with NDAs. The pattern was there if you knew where to look. At noon, Grace's phone rang. Unknown number. Her heart raced as she answered. Miss Williams? It was Margaret Winters. I wanted to check in, see if you had any questions. Hundreds, Grace admitted, but I'm still processing everything. That's understandable. I know this is overwhelming. Margaret's voice was calm, professional. I want you to know that everything we showed you yesterday is verifiable. If you want to bring in your own lawyer to review the contracts, we'll pay for that. If you want a second opinion on the medical evidence, we can arrange that too. Why are you being so accommodating? Because Christopher wants you to feel in control. This only works if you choose it freely. Coercion would poison the entire case. Grace was silent for a moment. Can I ask you something? Of course. Do you believe in him? In Christopher? Is he really doing this because it's right, or is there something else going on? Margaret sighed. I've worked for a lot of wealthy people, Miss Williams. Most of them hire me to protect their secrets, not expose them. Christopher is different. He's angry, yes. He's hurt by what his family did to his mother. But I've watched him for 6 months, and I genuinely believe he wants to fix this. Whether that's naivety or courage, I'm not sure. Maybe both. After they hung up, Grace sat in the library for another hour, thinking. At 2 p.m., she decided to take a risk. She drove to the Meridian Logistics warehouse. The building looked exactly as she remembered. Same concrete facade, same faded blue paint, same industrial aesthetic designed for function over form. Grace parked across the street and watched the loading docks where workers moved pallets and forklifts navigated between trucks. She recognized one of them, Danny Martinez. He'd been on the night crew with her 4 years ago. He looked older now, thinner, his movements slower than she remembered. Grace watched him for 20 minutes, noticed how he stopped occasionally to catch his breath, how he coughed into his elbow between tasks, how no one else seemed to notice or care. Her chest tightened. She was about to leave when someone tapped on her car window. Grace jumped, her heart leaping into her throat. A man stood outside, mid-40s, wearing a cheap suit and an expression that was trying to be friendly but missing by several degrees. Ma'am, can I help you with something? His tone was polite, but there was an edge to it. Grace rolled down her window slightly. I'm sorry? You've been sitting here for a while. This is private property. Are you looking for someone? I used to work here. Just feeling nostalgic. It was a weak excuse, but it was all she could think of. The man's smile didn't reach his eyes. Is that right? When was that? Few years ago. Cleaning crew. And your name? Warning bells went off in Grace's head. Why do you need my name? Just doing my job, ma'am. Security. We keep track of who's been around the facility. He pulled out a phone and casually took a photo of her license plate. Grace's blood ran cold. I wasn't doing anything wrong. Never said you were. Just protocol. He smiled again. You have a good day now. He walked back toward the warehouse, phone still in hand. Grace started her car with shaking hands and drove away, checking her rearview mirror every few seconds. The man didn't follow, but the damage was done. Someone at Meridian had noticed her. Someone had her license plate. And if they ran it, they'd have her name and address. By the time Grace got home, she was fighting full-blown panic. She'd been stupid, reckless. What had she been thinking, going back there? She'd potentially just exposed herself before even making a decision. Her phone rang. Margaret again. "We have a problem," Margaret said without preamble. "Someone just ran a DMV search on your vehicle registration. The query came from an IP address registered to Harrington Industries' security division." Grace's legs went weak. She sat down hard on her couch. "How do you know that?" "I have monitoring software on the company's systems. Christopher set it up before he started this. We've been tracking any searches related to Meridian employees, past and present. Your name just pinged." "I went to the warehouse," Grace admitted. "Someone took a photo of my plate." "Why would you—" Margaret stopped herself. "Never mind. What matters is they know you're looking. That changes the timeline." "What do you mean?" "If they're watching you now, we need to move faster, or we need to abort completely." Grace felt the walls closing in. "This is exactly what my sister warned me about. Your sister is right to be worried. This is dangerous." "But Grace," Margaret's voice softened, "they already know about you. They've known since you filed that OSHA complaint. They just didn't consider you a threat. But if they're watching you now, it means something spooked them. And the safest thing you can do at this point is not walk away. It's to go all in." "How is that safer?" "Because right now you're a loose end. Someone who knows something and might talk. But if you're our star witness, if you go public with full legal protection and media attention, you become too visible to touch. They can't make you disappear or intimidate you into silence when the whole world is watching." Grace's mind raced. "You're saying I'm safer if I testify than if I don't?" "I'm saying that ship sailed the moment you went to that warehouse. Now you need to decide. Do you trust us to protect you, or do you take your chances alone?" After Margaret hung up, Grace sat in her apartment, paralyzed by fear and indecision. This was spiraling out of control. She'd meant to take 48 hours, to carefully consider every angle. Instead, she'd made herself a target in less than 24. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "We need to talk. Tonight. Same address. This is important. CH." Grace stared at the message. Every instinct told her to run, to grab Maya and disappear. But Margaret was right. Where would they go? How would they hide? And for how long? At 5:30 p.m., Maya came home from school, chattering about a chemistry test she'd aced. Grace made dinner on autopilot, barely tasting the food, her mind elsewhere. "Mom, seriously, what's wrong?" Maya finally asked. "You've been weird since yesterday." Grace looked at her daughter. 17 years old, brilliant, with her whole future ahead of her. A future Grace had sacrificed everything to secure. "How would you feel about going to stay with Aunt Denise for a few days?" Grace asked carefully. Maya's eyes widened. "In Atlanta? Why? Is something wrong?" "No, baby. I have some things to handle. Work stuff. It would be easier if I knew you were safe with your aunt." "Safe?" Maya's voice rose. "Mom, you're scaring me. What's going on?" Grace realized she couldn't lie. Not about this. Maya deserved to know the truth, at least part of it. "Remember that job I had before the restaurant? At the warehouse?" Maya nodded slowly. "I witnessed some things there. Unsafe conditions. I tried to report it, but nothing happened. Now, someone is asking me to testify about what I saw, to help expose the company's practices. Testify? Like in court? Maybe. Or to investigators. It's complicated." Maya was quiet for a long moment. "Is it dangerous?" Grace couldn't lie about that either. "It could be." "Then don't do it." Maya's voice was firm. "Whatever they're offering you, it's not worth it. They're offering you a college trust fund. $200,000. Maya's mouth fell open. Then she shook her head vehemently. "I don't care. I don't want you to get hurt for money. I can take out loans. I can work. We'll figure it out." Grace felt tears sting her eyes. "Baby, it's not just about the money. People are getting sick. People I worked with. And if I don't speak up, someone else will." Maya stood up, her chair scraping against the floor. "Let someone else be the hero, Mom, please. You've done enough. You've worked yourself to death for me your whole life. Just let someone else take the risk this time." Grace pulled her daughter into a hug, feeling Maya shake with tears. "I love you," Grace whispered, "more than anything in this world. Then stay safe. Promise me." Grace couldn't make that promise, not honestly. At 8:00 p.m., Grace stood outside Azure Tower again. The same black sedan had picked her up. The same silent driver had delivered her to the underground garage. But this time, her hands weren't shaking with nervousness. They were shaking with resolve. The elevator ride to the 22nd floor felt shorter. When the doors opened, Christopher was waiting in the hallway. "Thank you for coming," he said. "I know today was... Someone from your company's security division searched my vehicle registration," Grace interrupted. "They know I was at the warehouse. They know I'm asking questions." Christopher's jaw tightened. "I know. Margaret told me. That's why I called you. We need to accelerate the timeline, or we need to stop this entirely. Stopping now won't make you safe, Grace. They've already flagged you as a potential problem. That's what Margaret said. But how do I know this isn't all part of some plan? How do I know you're not setting me up to take a fall while you... Come with me." Christopher turned and walked down the hall to Unit 2207. Grace followed. Inside the apartment, Margaret was waiting, along with someone new. A woman in her 30s with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun, wearing a gray pantsuit. "This is Sarah Chen," Christopher introduced her. "She's an investigative journalist with the Tribune. I've brought her here to verify everything we've told you. I'm giving her full access to our evidence. She'll publish her findings regardless of what you decide." Grace stared at him. "You're going ahead even without me?" "I have to. You were right to question my motives. You were right to be cautious. So I'm removing your leverage from the equation. The story goes public either way, but it will be stronger, more credible, more impactful if you're part of it." Sarah stepped forward, extending her hand. "Miss Williams, I've been reviewing the documents Christopher provided. I've independently verified 12 of the medical cases. This is real. This is going to be a major story. And yes, it will put you at risk. But I can promise you this. The Tribune will protect its sources. We have lawyers, resources, and a commitment to the truth." Grace shook her hand, her mind reeling. "I need you to understand something," Christopher said, his voice intense. "I'm doing this because it's right, but I'm also doing it because I'm angry. Angry at my father, angry at the company, angry at myself for not seeing it sooner. My motives aren't pure. I'm using you just like I'm using Margaret and Sarah and everyone else who's helping me. But I'm using you to accomplish something good. Does that make it okay? I don't know. That's for you to decide." Grace looked around the room. At Christopher, whose inheritance would be destroyed by this. At Margaret, who was risking her career. At Sarah, who was putting her reputation on the line. And she thought about Patricia Johnson, who'd brought cookies to work. About Danny Martinez struggling to breathe on a loading dock. About Carmen Rodriguez, fighting for disability benefits while raising a son alone. "I want protection for my daughter," Grace said finally. "Real protection, not just money. If I do this, Maya goes to Atlanta until it's over. You arrange it, you pay for it, and you make sure no one from your family or your company can touch her." "Done," Christopher said immediately. "And I want editorial approval on anything Sarah publishes about me. My words, my story, the way I want to tell it." Sarah nodded. "Agreed. And one more thing." Grace's voice hardened. "If this goes sideways, if your family comes after me legally or otherwise, you don't abandon me. You see it through to the end, no matter what it costs you." Christopher met her eyes. "You have my word." Grace took a deep breath. "Then let's burn it all down." 3 weeks later, Grace sat in a conference room at the Chicago Tribune's headquarters, staring at a room full of lawyers, journalists, and federal investigators. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city stretched out beneath a gray November sky, the first snow of the season beginning to fall. Maya was safe in Atlanta. Denise had picked her up from the airport 2 days after Grace's decision, asking no questions when Grace explained that she needed her daughter protected for a while. The college trust had been transferred immediately, $200,000 sitting in an account that would ensure Maya's future regardless of what happened next. Now came the hard part. "Miss Williams," said Agent Rebecca Torres from the EPA's Criminal Investigation Division, "let's start from the beginning. When did you first notice the unsafe conditions at Meridian Logistics?" Grace took a deep breath and began to speak. She talked for 3 hours, described the chemical smell that burned her nostrils every night, the workers who developed mysterious coughs and rashes, the storage area where barrels marked with hazard symbols sat without proper ventilation, the young man who'd collapsed and been carried out on a stretcher while supervisors told everyone it was nothing serious. She described filing the OSHA complaint anonymously, checking every day for weeks to see if anyone would investigate, and then being fired 3 weeks later with no explanation beyond budget cuts. "Did anyone threaten you directly?" Agent Torres asked. "No, They didn't have to. The message was clear. Ask questions, lose your job. Margaret sat beside Grace taking notes. Christopher and Sarah were in an adjacent room watching through a window. The separation was deliberate. The investigation needed to be seen as independent, untainted by the Harrington heirs' involvement. Miss Williams, another investigator said, are you aware that coming forward makes you a target for retaliation? I'm aware. And you're willing to testify publicly if this goes to trial? Grace thought about Patricia Johnson's cookies, about Danny Martinez struggling to breathe, about all the people still working in those facilities trusting that someone cared about their safety. Yes, she said firmly. I'm willing. The story broke 4 days later. Sarah's article appeared on the Tribune's front page under the headline, Chicago Manufacturing Giant Accused of Systematic Safety Violations. The piece was meticulous, devastating. Medical records, internal memos, expert testimony from industrial safety specialists, and at the center of it all, Grace's first-hand account. Within hours, every major news outlet in the country had picked it up. Grace's phone exploded with calls from reporters, lawyers, and strangers wanting to share their own stories about Harrington Industries. Margaret screened everything, but the volume was overwhelming. On the second day, Charles Harrington III held a press conference. Grace watched it from the secure apartment Christopher had arranged for her, a modest place in Evanston, far from her old neighborhood. On the television screen, the elder Harrington stood behind a podium, looking every inch the distinguished CEO. These allegations are completely unfounded, he said, his voice steady and authoritative. Harrington Industries has always prioritized worker safety. We comply with all federal regulations and conduct regular audits of our facilities. This appears to be a coordinated attack on our company's reputation, and we will vigorously defend ourselves against these false claims. He didn't mention his son, didn't acknowledge that the investigation had been triggered by someone inside the family. But Grace knew that silence spoke volumes. The first lawsuit was filed within a week, then another, then 10 more. Workers from all 7 Harrington facilities came forward, many of them speaking publicly for the first time about illnesses they'd developed, medical bills they couldn't pay, disability claims that had been denied. The EPA announced a full investigation. OSHA opened its own inquiry. The Department of Justice began reviewing potential criminal charges. And through it all, Christopher stayed in the shadows. Grace met with him only once during those first chaotic weeks, at Margaret's office after midnight when the reporters had finally gone home. How are you holding up? He asked. Grace laughed bitterly. There are photographers outside my building. My ex-husband called asking if the stories are true. Someone leaked my address to a conspiracy website claiming I'm part of a corporate espionage scheme. So I've been better. I'm sorry. I knew it would be bad, but don't apologize. I made this choice. Grace looked at him carefully. How's your father? Christopher's expression hardened. He's dying. The Alzheimer's is progressing faster than expected. His lawyers are scrambling to distance the company from him, claiming he wasn't mentally competent when the decisions were made. It's ugly. Do you believe that he didn't know? No, he knew. He just didn't care. Christopher's voice was hollow. I confronted him last week, showed him the medical records. He looked at me and said, business is about making hard choices. That's all he had to say, hard choices. Grace felt unexpected sympathy for the young man sitting across from her. He'd destroyed his family's legacy, burned every bridge to his former life, all because he'd discovered his inheritance was built on suffering. What will you do? She asked. After this is over? I don't know. The board is trying to force me out. My trust fund is frozen pending the investigation. My name is toxic. He smiled without humor. Turns out being a whistleblower isn't great for your career prospects. Join the club. They sat in silence for a moment. Grace, Christopher said finally, I want you to know that whatever happens, even if this all falls apart, even if the company wins, even if public opinion turns against us, you did the right thing. You gave those workers a voice that matters. I hope so, Grace said quietly, because I can't go back to being invisible now. That door is permanently closed. The turning point came 6 weeks after the story broke. A whistleblower from inside Harrington Industries, a senior engineer named David Park, came forward with internal documents proving that executives had known about the ventilation problems for years. Email chains discussing the cost-benefit analysis of proper safety equipment versus potential lawsuits. Memos outlining strategies to suppress complaints and pay off inspectors. The evidence was damning. 3 executives were arrested. Federal charges included willful violation of safety standards, conspiracy to defraud regulatory agencies, and corporate manslaughter. Harrington Industries' stock price collapsed. The company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection, and Grace received a call from Carmen Rodriguez. "Miss Williams?" The voice on the phone was young, shaky. "I don't know if you remember me. I was one of the workers." "I remember," Grace said softly. "How are you, Carmen?" "Better, getting treatment. There's a settlement offer from the company. It's not enough, but it's something." She paused. "I called to say thank you for speaking up, for not being afraid." "I was terrified," Grace admitted, "but you did it anyway. That's what courage is, right?" After they hung up, Grace sat in her apartment and cried. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming weight of what they'd accomplished. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't complete, but it was justice. Spring came to Chicago with sudden warmth, melting the last of winter's snow and coaxing crocuses from frozen ground. Grace stood outside Northwestern University's campus watching students hurry between classes, and felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Maya had returned from Atlanta 2 weeks earlier. Once the media attention had died down and the immediate danger had passed, she'd been accepted to Northwestern with her scholarship intact, plus the college trust ensuring she'd never worry about expenses. But it was the other change that mattered more. Grace had been offered a job, not at a restaurant, not cleaning offices, but at a nonprofit organization dedicated to workplace safety advocacy. They wanted her to speak at events, train workers on their rights, help others find the courage to report unsafe conditions. Someone had seen her, really seen her, and now they wanted to amplify her voice instead of silencing it. "Mom?" Maya appeared beside her, backpack slung over one shoulder. "You ready for the tour?" They were visiting the campus together, seeing where Maya would spend the next 4 years. Grace linked her arm through her daughter's and smiled. "I'm ready." As they walked through the quad, Grace's phone buzzed. A text from Christopher. Federal judge approved the settlement, $47 million to affected workers. Harrington Industries ceasing all operations at the facilities. "Thought you'd want to know." Grace stopped walking, reading the message twice to make sure it was real. "Good news?" Maya asked. "Very good news." They continued walking, and Grace felt the weight she'd been carrying for years finally begin to lift. The invisibility that had defined her existence was gone. She'd stepped into the light, and yes, it had been terrifying. It had cost her sleep and safety, and the comfortable anonymity she'd hidden behind. But it had also given her something precious. The knowledge that one person, one voice, one act of courage could actually matter. 6 months later, Grace stood on a stage at a workers' rights conference in Washington, D.C. In front of her sat 200 people, union representatives, safety advocates, workers from across the country who'd fought their own battles against corporate negligence. "My name is Grace Williams," she began, her voice steady. "And for most of my life I was invisible." She told them her story, not just about Harrington Industries, but about every job where she'd been treated as furniture, every moment of being looked through instead of looked at, every time she'd swallowed her dignity to keep a paycheck coming. And she told them about the moment she decided to stop being invisible. "I was terrified," she said. "I'm still terrified sometimes, but I learned something important. They can only make you invisible if you let them. The moment you speak up, the moment you say, 'This is wrong and I won't be silent,' that's when you become visible. That's when you become powerful." The audience erupted in applause. Afterward, people lined up to shake her hand, to share their own stories, to ask for advice. Grace listened to each one, remembering what it felt like to have no one listen to her. Christopher appeared near the back of the room. They'd stayed in touch over the months, occasional messages checking in on each other. He'd found work with a small environmental nonprofit, using his business degree and insider knowledge to help organizations navigate corporate structures. "That was incredible," he said when she finally broke free from the crowd. "I'm still getting used to public speaking. My hands were shaking the whole time." "Couldn't tell." He smiled. "You looked fearless." "I've learned that looking fearless and being fearless are two different things." They walked outside together into the warm June evening. "Have you heard from your father?" Grace asked carefully. Christopher's expression clouded. "He's in a memory care facility now. Most days he doesn't remember me. Maybe that's for the best." "I'm sorry." "Don't be." He made his choices. Christopher looked at her. "We both did. And I'd make the same choice again. Even knowing what it cost you? Especially knowing what it cost me. Because now when I look in the mirror, I don't see someone who profited from other people's suffering. I see someone who tried to make it right." He paused. "That's worth more than any inheritance." Grace nodded, understanding completely. They said goodbye on the sidewalk, knowing they'd see each other again at the next conference, the next hearing, the next battle, in an ongoing war for dignity and safety in the workplace. As Grace walked back to her hotel, her phone buzzed with a message from Maya. "How'd it go, Mom? Did you crush it?" Grace smiled and typed back, "I think I did, baby. I really think I did." She looked up at the city lights, at the people rushing past her on the sidewalk, and realized something profound. She was no longer invisible, not because someone had finally chosen to see her, but because she'd chosen to be seen. And that made all the difference. 2 years after the story broke, Grace stood in the lobby of a newly renovated community center on Chicago's South Side. The plaque on the wall read, "The Patricia Johnson Worker Advocacy Center, in memory of those we lost, in service of those we protect." Grace had fought for that name. Patricia deserved to be remembered as more than a statistic, more than a settlement check. She deserved to be the symbol of why this work mattered. "Mom, they're ready for you," Maya called from the doorway. Her daughter looked every inch the law student now, confident, poised, ready to fight battles of her own. The ribbon-cutting ceremony drew a modest crowd, former Meridian workers, safety advocates, local politicians looking for good press. But Grace's eyes found the faces that mattered. Carmen Rodriguez, walking without assistance now, her son beside her. Danny Martinez, retired on disability but alive. David Park, the engineer whose evidence had sealed the case, now teaching workplace safety at a community college. And in the back row, wearing a simple blazer instead of his old tailored suits, Christopher Harrington. He caught her eye and nodded, a silent acknowledgement of how far they'd both traveled from that night in Étoile Noire. Grace cut the ribbon to applause, then stepped to the microphone. "3 years ago, I was invisible," she began. "I moved through spaces where wealthy people dined and did business, and not one of them saw me as fully human. I was a function, a service, background noise." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "But invisibility is a choice they make, not a condition we're born into. The moment I chose to speak, to stand up, to refuse to stay silent, that's when I became visible. Not because they finally decided to see me, but because I decided I was worth seeing." Her voice strengthened. "This center exists because ordinary people did extraordinary things. They spoke up when it was dangerous. They testified when it was terrifying. They refused to accept that their suffering was the cost of doing business." Grace looked directly at the former workers in the audience. "You were never invisible. You were always there, always valuable, always worthy of dignity and safety. It just took the world too long to notice. But now we've built something that ensures the next generation won't have to fight so hard to be seen." After the ceremony, as people mingled over coffee and pastries, Christopher approached her. "You've built something remarkable," he said. "We've built something remarkable," Grace corrected. "Your testimony to Congress about corporate accountability helped push through the new regulations. Don't diminish what you did. I destroyed my family's company. You stopped your family's company from destroying more families." Grace's voice was gentle but firm. "There's a difference." Christopher smiled, the shadows in his eyes a little lighter than they'd been 2 years ago. "My mother would have been proud. That's what I tell myself anyway. I think she would have been." He glanced around the center, at the resource library, the legal aid office, the training rooms where workers could learn about their rights. "Do you ever regret it? The attention, the stress, everything you gave up?" Grace thought about that night, standing under a streetlight with a key in her palm and a choice in front of her. She thought about the fear, the sleepless nights, the cameras and reporters and threats. But she also thought about Carmen Rodriguez walking on her own, about new safety regulations protecting thousands of workers, about Maya, fierce and brilliant, choosing to fight for justice as a career. "Not for a second," Grace said. "Do you?" "Not for a second." That evening, Grace returned to her apartment, a nicer place now in a safer neighborhood, paid for by her salary at the advocacy center. Maya was spending the weekend with friends, so the space was quiet. Grace made tea and sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker on as dusk fell. Her phone buzzed with messages, colleagues congratulating her on the center's opening, reporters requesting interviews, workers asking for help with their own cases. She responded to each one carefully, remembering what it felt like when no one responded to her. Among the messages was one from an unknown number. "You probably don't remember me, but I was a busboy at Étoile Noire. I watched what you did, how you stood up to them. I just reported unsafe conditions at my new job. I was scared, but I thought about you. Thank you for showing us we can be brave." Grace read the message 3 times, tears streaming down her face. This was the ripple effect Christopher had talked about. One act of courage inspiring another, then another, spreading outward like circles on water. She'd been invisible for 42 years, but in choosing to be seen, she'd helped others find their own visibility. And that, Grace realized, was the real victory. Not the settlements or the new laws or the advocacy center with Patricia's name on the wall, but the busboy who'd watched her and learned that ordinary people could challenge the powerful. The young workers who'd speak up tomorrow because someone had spoken up today. The next generation who'd enter workplaces knowing they had value, knowing they had rights, knowing they had a voice. Grace picked up her phone and texted back, "I remember you, Marcus, and I'm proud of you. Stay brave, you're not alone." Outside her window, Chicago glowed in the gathering dark. Somewhere in that vast city, someone was working a night shift in difficult conditions. Someone was being treated as invisible. Someone was deciding whether to speak up or stay silent. Grace couldn't save them all, couldn't fight every battle or right every wrong, but she could be visible. She could be vocal. She could be the proof that one person's courage could spark a movement, and sometimes that was enough. She finished her tea, opened her laptop, and began drafting her speech for next week's congressional hearing on workplace safety reform. There was still so much work to do, but Grace Williams was no longer invisible, and she was just getting started.